In 52 BC, the heavy infantry of the Roman Republic stood at the base of Gergovia, staring up at a towering volcanic plateau in the heart of central Gaul. The steep, dusty incline of the terraced rock offered no reliable foothold for standard Roman formations, instantly neutralizing the offensive momentum of the finest military machine in the ancient world. It was upon these jagged slopes that Julius Caesar, the proconsul who had spent 6 years systematically dismantling the Celtic tribes, suffered the most humiliating tactical disaster of his entire career. Caesar had built his reputation on engineering brilliance and unbreakable legionary discipline, but at Gergovia, that very discipline was weaponized against the Romans themselves. Driven by aggressive hubris and a catastrophic breakdown in the chain of command, the veteran legions ignored their recall orders, abandoning their structural integrity to launch a fragmented, uphill assault against an impossible geological defense. The result was a complete mechanical failure of Roman tactical doctrine that cost Caesar the lives of 46 seasoned centurions and roughly 700 veteran legionaries, proving that even the most hardened forces could be dismantled when ambition outpaced logistical reality. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today we break down the disaster at Gergovia, examining the unforgiving terrain, the fatal command miscommunication, and the aggressive overconfidence that shattered the myth of Roman invincibility in Gaul. To understand how the greatest Roman commander lost control of his own veterans, we must first look at the trap the Gallic coalition laid weeks before the first sword was drawn. The spark that ignited this catastrophic chain of events was struck months earlier at the commercial hub of Sinabum. In early 52 BC, a sudden and brutal uprising resulted in the massacre of the Roman citizens residing there, including merchants and key logistics officials overseeing the provincial grain supply. The news of this slaughter spread rapidly across the fractured tribes of Gaul, acting as a signal for widespread rebellion. At the center of this newly formed coalition stood Vercingetorix, an Arvernian chieftain who fundamentally understood the mechanics of the Roman war machine. Unlike previous tribal leaders who had charged blindly into the meat grinder of the Roman shield wall, Vercingetorix recognized that the heavy infantry of the Republic could not be defeated in a pitched, conventional battle. To break Caesar, he had to break his logistics. Vercingetorix instituted a ruthless, highly disciplined strategy of scorched earth. He ordered the Gallic coalition to systematically burn their own towns, farms, and vital grain stores. As the Roman legions advanced deeper into the territory, they were greeted not by targetable armies, but by the choking haze of burning crop fields that blackened the horizon. This was a calculated logistical strangulation. A Roman army of 30,000 men required massive daily caloric intake to maintain its punishing marching pace and engineering operations. By erasing the local food supply, the Gallic commander forced Caesar to rely on overextended and highly vulnerable supply lines, slowing the Roman advance to an agonizing crawl. Instead of offering Caesar the decisive field engagement he desperately needed to stabilize the province, Vercingetorix withdrew the bulk of his forces to his tribal capital, Gergovia. This was not a retreat, it was a deliberate geographical anchor. Gergovia sat atop a massive volcanic plateau, surrounded by sheer rock faces and naturally terraced slopes that heavily favored a static defense. By consolidating his coalition on this elevated fortress, Vercingetorix engineered a perfect operational dilemma. If Caesar ignored Gergovia, he would leave a massive, unified enemy army operating safely in his rear. If he attacked, he would be forced to fight an uphill battle of attrition against a well-supplied enemy, while his own legions slowly starved on the plains below. The Roman proconsul, driven by the need to maintain political momentum, chose the offensive. Caesar marched his legions to the base of Gergovia, expecting a standard siege, completely unaware that the political ground beneath his feet was already beginning to collapse. Arriving at the plains below Gergovia, Caesar deployed a formidable war machine consisting of 6 veteran legions, totaling roughly 30,000 heavy infantry, supplemented by allied auxiliary cavalry. These were the men who had spent 6 years subjugating Gaul, experts in the rigid deployment of the scutum, the heavy rectangular shield, and the pilum, a specialized javelin designed to shatter enemy lines before the close quarters clash. Yet, as they entrenched their marching camps, the Roman veterans faced an enemy that could not be outflanked or intimidated by engineering. The plateau of Gergovia rose imposing and abrupt, elevating the Arvernian capital 1,200 feet above the surrounding plains. It was not merely a hill, but a sprawling geological fortress surrounded by sheer volcanic cliffs and naturally stepped terraces. This geography fundamentally neutralized standard Roman tactical doctrine. In a conventional field engagement, the legions relied on a steady, horizontal advance where their overlapping shields created an impenetrable wall of wood and iron. However, attempting to fight up a steep gradient actively destroys this structural cohesion. A legionary climbing a 1,200-foot incline burns massive amounts of muscular energy, simply maintaining his balance against the uneven earth, rendering him unable to lock his shield effectively with the man beside him. Furthermore, the severe upward angle stripped the pilum of its lethal kinetic energy and effective range. Conversely, the elevation amplified the momentum and destructive power of any stone or spear hurled downward by the defenders. The physical environment dictated a grim reality. The heavier and more armored the Roman soldier was, the more disadvantaged he became on the slopes. Understanding this absolute mathematical advantage, Vercingetorix did not simply garrison his vast tribal coalition behind the gates of the main citadel. Instead, he meticulously deployed his Gallic warriors across the lower terraces and jagged ridges that ringed the plateau, turning the entire mountain into a multi-layered weapon. By commanding the construction of a continuous 6-foot-high stone wall along the mid-level slopes, the Gallic commander created an extended perimeter that forced the Romans to pay in casualties for every foot of elevation gained. Vercingetorix possessed the luxury of time and the absolute security of the high ground. He maintained strict defensive patience, refusing to take the bait of an open battle, and simply watched as the Roman supply network strained to feed a 30,000-man army in a deliberately scorched province. Caesar required an immediate, decisive breach to salvage the campaign, but the sheer rock faces offered no viable angle for his engineers to construct their legendary siege ramps. The geography alone made a direct assault suicidal, but a sudden betrayal forced the Roman commander to abandon logic for desperation. The betrayal that derailed Caesar's measured siege did not come from the hostile warriors entrenched on the plateau, but from Rome's oldest and most vital political allies in Gaul, the Aedui. For 6 consecutive years of warfare, the Aedui had operated as the logistical spine of the Roman expeditionary force. They controlled the sprawling supply networks and grain convoys required to feed the ravenous Roman war machine. Without their constant agricultural tribute, sustaining a concentrated force of 30,000 heavy infantry deep in hostile territory was a physical impossibility. Recognizing that Caesar was now geographically pinned at Gergovia and increasingly isolated by Vercingetorix's scorched earth tactics, an ambitious Aeduan nobleman named Litovicus struck. He intercepted a column of 10,000 Aeduan allied troops marching to reinforce the Roman siege lines and fed them a fabricated narrative, claiming that Caesar had orchestrated a systematic massacre of the Aeduan nobility. The mutiny was immediate. The sudden defection of these troops effectively severed the Roman supply lines, tightening a logistical noose around Caesar's neck. If the entire Aeduan nation joined Vercingetorix, the Roman expedition would not just lose its food, it would lose its only secure avenue of retreat back to the Republic's borders. Caesar was thrust into an operational nightmare that demanded a desperate division of his forces. Operating under extreme temporal and political pressure, the proconsul stripped his siege camp of its primary fighting strength. He mobilized 4 of his veteran legions and all his auxiliary cavalry, leaving the main camp at the base of the mountain dangerously undermanned under the command of his lieutenant, Gaius Fabius. Taking only the bare minimum of supplies, Caesar drove his heavy infantry into a punishing, high-speed forced march of 25 miles across the Gallic plains to intercept Litaviccus. The relentless, synchronized thud of hobnailed caligae striking the hard dirt marked a pace that defied standard military logistics, pushing the physical endurance of his men to the absolute breaking point. The sheer speed of the Roman response paralyzed the mutiny. Caesar intercepted the Aeduan column before they could link up with Vercingetorix, exposing Litaviccus's lies and bloodlessly forcing the 10,000 allied troops back into submission. However, the strategic cost of this rapid maneuver nearly destroyed his foothold at Gergovia. Vercingetorix possessed excellent battlefield intelligence and immediately recognized that the Roman camp had been critically weakened. From their elevated fortress, the Gallic forces poured down the slopes, launching a massive, sustained assault against the entrenched Roman perimeter. Fabius and his 2 remaining legions found themselves pinned behind their timber barricades, absorbing a continuous, plunging barrage of missiles and heavy stones from the higher ground. As desperate couriers raced out to inform Caesar that the camp defenses were on the verge of collapsing, the proconsul was forced to demand the impossible from his already exhausted veterans. Without allowing his troops a single night of rest, Caesar ordered the 4 legions to immediately reverse their route and force march the 25 miles back to the base of the plateau. The severe physical toll of covering 50 miles in full armor and subduing a rebellion in just over 24 hours drained the vital stamina of the Roman heavy infantry before the main battle had even commenced. Their arrival stabilized the perimeter and forced the Gauls to withdraw back up the terraces, narrowly averting a total collapse. Caesar managed to save his camp, but the political clock had run out. He needed a decisive victory, and he needed it immediately. Caesar realized that a frontal assault against the fully manned Arvernian defenses was an impossibility, especially with his heavy infantry already physically taxed by the recent forced marches. He needed to alter the geographic reality of the battlefield. To achieve this, he first secured a secondary, highly contested hill closer to the plateau's base, establishing what became known as the small camp. He then ordered his engineers to dig a massive, 12-foot-wide double trench connecting this forward operating base to his main headquarters. This vital fortification allowed Roman infantry to move securely between the 2 camps without being exposed to the constant, plunging missile fire from the Gallic positions above. With this logistical artery secured, Caesar prepared a highly orchestrated tactical deception designed to pull Vercingetorix's eyes and his warriors away from the southern terraces, which the Roman commander had identified as the most viable, albeit steep, avenue of approach. The execution of this feint required absolute discipline and theatrical precision. Under the cover of darkness, Caesar dispatched a large contingent of his baggage train muleteers, ordering them to don the helmets and cloaks of regular auxiliary cavalrymen. Mounted on draft horses and mules, this decoy force was instructed to ride openly toward the western ridge of the plateau at first light, deliberately dragging heavy brush and branches behind them to kick up massive, obscuring columns of dust. To the Gallic sentries observing from the heights, the visual evidence was undeniable. It appeared as though a sweeping Roman flanking maneuver was underway, threatening to encircle their western perimeter and sever their remaining lines of communication into the surrounding province. Vercingetorix, normally a cautious and calculating commander, took the bait. Aware that the western approach was a geographical weak point in his overall defensive network, he ordered a massive redeployment. He shifted thousands of his best Gallic warriors away from the heavily fortified southern and eastern slopes, rushing them to reinforce the threatened western ridge. While the enemy command scrambled to meet this phantom threat, Caesar executed his true tactical movement. In the tense, pre-dawn hours, he secretly transferred several of his most elite veteran cohorts from the main camp directly into the small camp. To ensure the trap remained hidden, the legionaries were ordered to muffle their iron mail and move in absolute silence, keeping their unit standards lowered and concealed until they were securely positioned at the immediate base of the southern terraces. The tactical board had been successfully manipulated. Caesar's operational deception had drawn the vast majority of the Arvernian defenders entirely out of position. The diversion worked perfectly, leaving the lower terraces virtually unguarded, but the Roman commander was about to lose control of his own weapon. The moment the command was issued, the Roman heavy infantry surged from the confines of the small camp. Elements of the 8th, 10th, and 13th legions rapidly closed the distance across the lower elevations, aggressively exploiting the tactical void created by Vercingetorix's redeployment. Despite the punishing gradient that strained their calves and fractured their standard checkerboard formations, the sheer physical momentum of the advancing veteran cohorts carried them relentlessly upward. They swiftly reached the continuous 6-foot stone wall the Gauls had engineered to fortify the mid-level terraces. Stripped of its primary defenders, the barricade proved completely inadequate. The Roman infantry vaulted over the stonework, pouring into the outer defensive perimeter with the highly synchronized aggression that had already subdued half of the Celtic world. Within minutes, the Roman vanguard swept horizontally across the lower terraces, systematically dismantling 3 separate Gallic encampments that had been left fatally exposed. The speed and violence of the uphill assault were so overwhelming that the remaining allied Gallic chieftains were caught entirely unprepared. In one of the overrun positions, the king of the Nitiobroges was forced to abandon his personal quarters in a frantic bid for survival, reportedly fleeing the camp half-dressed on a stolen horse. To the Roman command, the initial phase of the operation was an unqualified tactical triumph. Caesar had successfully breached the outer defenses without committing to a protracted siege, inflicted a sharp psychological blow to the coalition, and secured a highly defensible foothold directly on the plateau. Having achieved this precise, limited operational objective, Caesar recognized the shifting geometry of the battlefield. Pushing further up the steepest sections of the slope toward the heavily fortified main gates of the citadel would stretch his infantry beyond their structural capacity. Standing on a commanding ridge, he signaled for the tuba, the heavy brass Roman trumpet, to sound the sharp, resonant blare of the recall order. Standard Roman military doctrine dictated that upon hearing this precise metallic note, the advance must immediately halt and the cohorts reform their defensive lines. However, these were not fresh recruits. They were battle-hardened veterans fueled by years of unbroken victories and pushed to a volatile psychological edge by their recent 50-mile forced march. Their fatigue had mutated into a dangerous, blood-drunk hubris, convincing the rank and file that the entire mountain fortress was already broken. Caesar ordered the retreat, but in the chaos of the captured camps, the veteran legions made a decision that doomed them all. The sharp, metallic blast of the tuba was entirely swallowed by the roar of thousands of men surging uphill. The Roman heavy infantry, historically a paragon of mechanical obedience, fractured under the weight of its own psychological momentum. Exhausted from their grueling 50-mile march the previous day, the legionaries were now driven by a dangerous, adrenaline-fueled hubris, convinced that the Arvernian capital was within their immediate grasp. Furthermore, the steep, jagged terraces physically blocked the lines of sight back to the command ridge, effectively severing the visual tether between Caesar and his forward units. The Centurions, the disciplined iron spine of the legions, found themselves incapable of physically halting the human tide. Instead of re-establishing a cohesive defensive line, these veteran officers were swept upward, dragged along by the sheer kinetic force of their own advancing cohorts. This insubordinate push carried the fragmented Roman vanguard all the way to the towering stone walls of the upper citadel. Handfuls of legionaries actually reached the main gates, gasping for breath but desperate to force a breach. However, this severe overextension triggered the exact operational disaster Caesar had meticulously tried to avoid. From his vantage point on the western ridge, Vercingetorix quickly recognized that the Roman cavalry maneuvers were merely a hollow decoy. Without hesitation, the Gallic commander wheeled his massive tribal coalition around, redirecting thousands of fresh, heavily armed warriors back to the southern sector. The tactical geometry of the battlefield instantly inverted. The Roman troops were now completely out of formation, physically spent, and pinned directly against the unyielding walls of the fortress. When Vercingetorix unleashed his counterattack, the environmental disparity dictated the outcome. The Gauls charged downhill, letting gravity amplify the destructive impact of their heavy slashing swords and spears. On the steep, uneven gradient, the legendary Roman checkerboard formation, the triplex aces, was mechanically impossible to maintain. A legionary requires level ground to plant his feet, brace his heavy scutum, and absorb an enemy charge. Deprived of this physical anchor, the Roman shield wall shattered upon contact, leaving individual soldiers highly vulnerable to the crushing downward momentum of the Gallic warriors. As the Roman vanguard began to buckle under this relentless pressure, a large cavalry force suddenly materialized on their exposed right flank. These were the Aedui, the allied tribal horsemen Caesar had recently subdued and ordered to support the right wing of the assault. But in the chaotic, dust-choked environment of the collapsing terraces, their arrival catalyzed a fatal misunderstanding. The Aeduan riders wore armor and wielded weapons fundamentally identical to those of the hostile Gallic coalition. Although the Aedui bared their right shoulders, a traditional Celtic battlefield gesture intended to signify peaceful intent, this cultural nuance was completely lost on the terrified, exhausted Roman infantrymen. Believing they had been outflanked and betrayed yet again, the psychological strain on the Roman lines finally reached its breaking point. Absolute panic infected the cohorts. The structural discipline that defined the legions evaporated, and the forward units broke, turning their backs to the enemy in a frantic scramble down the very slopes they had just conquered. Trapped against the walls of the citadel, the Roman heavy infantry had nowhere to run, and the officers had to pay the price in blood. As the veteran cohorts disintegrated into a terrified mob plunging down the jagged terraces, the survival of the Roman expedition fell entirely to its officer corps. The Centurions, men promoted for their unflinching discipline and close-quarters combat lethality, understood the grim mechanics of a rout. If the fleeing heavy infantry were allowed to be run down from behind, the entire army would be destroyed. Refusing to succumb to the contagious panic, these officers halted their own retreats. They turned and formed desperate, isolated pockets of resistance along the steep pathways, deliberately anchoring themselves against the downhill momentum of the Gallic countercharge to buy precious seconds for their fleeing subordinates. The sacrifice of Marcus Petronius, a centurion of the 8th Legion, perfectly encapsulated the Roman concept of dignitas and ultimate military duty. Finding himself surrounded by Arvernian warriors near the gates of the upper citadel, he realized his position was completely untenable. Battered and bleeding from multiple wounds, he turned to the legionaries of his maniple and ordered them to escape down the slope. Petronius then charged directly into the closing mass of enemy fighters, trading his own life to create a momentary physical barrier. His deliberate suicide was not an isolated act of desperation. Across the sprawling incline, 46 Roman centurions were systematically cut down as they held the line against impossible odds. The loss of these officers was a devastating structural blow. Centurions were the irreplaceable managers of Roman warfare, representing decades of institutional memory and tactical experience that could not simply be replenished with new recruits. Down on the plain, Caesar recognized that his fragmented vanguard was moments away from total destruction. Operating with cold pragmatism, he immediately deployed his final reserve, the elite 10th Legion, advancing them to the very base of the plateau. This maneuver was not a counterattack, but the creation of an impenetrable physical backstop. As the exhausted survivors of the assault finally staggered onto level ground, they funneled safely behind the rigid, overlapping shields of the 10th. Faced with a fresh wall of heavy infantry deployed on flat terrain, the precise environment where Roman tactical doctrine was unmatched, the Gallic pursuit abruptly halted. Vercingetorix, adhering strictly to his overarching defensive strategy, recalled his warriors to the high ground rather than risking a conventional clash on the plain. The tactical bleeding had been stopped, but the butcher's bill was staggering. Roughly 700 veteran legionaries lay dead on the slopes of Gergovia, their armor and weapons left to be stripped by the victorious coalition. For a commander who had built an aura of invincibility across 6 years of conquest, the optics of the defeat were far worse than the mathematical loss of men. The Roman army survived total annihilation, but as Caesar looked up at the plateau, he knew the political damage was catastrophic. The defeat at Gergovia shattered the carefully constructed myth of Roman invincibility, sending shockwaves across the province. For the first time in 6 years of grueling warfare, Julius Caesar was forced to lift a siege and order a strategic retreat. Recognizing that his supply lines were fundamentally broken and his political alliances were unraveling, the proconsul marched his battered legions away from the Arvernian capital to regroup closer to the borders of the Roman Republic. This visible withdrawal acted as a massive catalyst for the Gallic rebellion. Tribes that had previously remained neutral or even loyal to Rome perceived Caesar's vulnerability and immediately defected to Vercingetorix. The Arvernian chieftain was formally recognized as the supreme commander of a near-unified Gallic coalition, a level of political cohesion the Celtic world had never before achieved. Vercingetorix had proven that a disciplined, defensive strategy utilizing elevated terrain and scorched earth could successfully break the Roman heavy infantry. However, this monumental victory bred a fatal overconfidence within the Gallic ranks. Believing that Roman tactics had been permanently neutralized, the coalition would carry this hubris into their next major confrontation later that year, allowing themselves to be trapped within the fortified walls of Alesia. Gergovia stands as a testament to the fact that even the most perfect military machine can be dismantled by the combination of hostile geography, logistical starvation, and the arrogance of its own veterans. Please subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.